Hey, this is Mark Altman of Inglorious Treksperts. And you know all those great crossovers, like when Happy Days would cross over with Laverne and Shirley and Next Generation, like, at the beginning of Emissary, where Picard would show up at the beginning of Deep Space Nine? Well, have we got a crossover for you? Today, it's a very special team-up. It's like a superhero team-up. It's like Superman and Muhammad Ali, or Spider-Man meets... what was it? Spider-Man? I don't even remember. But anyway, you get the point. We're teaming up with Trek Politics, the great podcast from Bob CESCA and Mary Trump about politics and Star Trek, to bring you a very special panel that the Inglorious Treksperts produced at Star Trek Las Vegas. This was a panel on the politics of Star Trek at Las Vegas, featuring moderated by myself, Mark A. Altman of Inglorious Treksperts, and featuring David A. Goodman, Ande Kindred, Tim Russ, Mary McDonnell, Bob CESCA, and zooming in, who's zooming who, the great Mary Trump. And we're about to share that with you. I have to tell you, and this is, the audio may be a little dodgy because unfortunately there were technical difficulties recording this panel through the soundboard at the convention. However, we were lucky enough, because Mary had zoomed in, to have a archival version of the podcast. So thanks to Bob CESCA and Trek Politics, who's done his best to restore the audio and give us something listenable, which I think it very much is. You'll get to share this incredible panel for Star Trek Las Vegas. I'm so excited to bring it to you. I hope it's the first of many. And now sit back and enjoy this very special all-star team-up of Inglorious Treksperts and Trek's Politics. And we'll see you next week here on Inglorious Treksperts for the Season 7 premiere of Inglorious Treksperts. And if you're a Treksperts Plus subscriber, you can listen to that now on Spotify. But fear not, all episodes are available to all our listeners with a 1-week delay wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll see you then, and enjoy this very special bonus episode of Inglorious Treksperts.
This episode is brought to you by Jira. Ever wonder how those big marketing campaigns that make headlines get delivered on time? It all starts with Jira, the only project management tool you need to plan and track work across any team. Every step of that campaign is organized in one place, from launching the campaign all the way back to designing ads and writing creative briefs. Get started on your next big marketing campaign idea today in Jira.
This episode is brought to you by Batiste Dry Shampoo. Whether you're on the go, at the gym, or getting ready for a night out, Batiste has a dry shampoo for you. Refresh with over 10 signature fragrances. Or try Batiste Hint of Color, a tinted dry shampoo that seamlessly blends with your hair. Need an extra boost? Try Batiste Dry Shampoo with added benefits, like volumizing, texturizing, and more. Buy Batiste now, in-store or online at your nearest retailer.
Hey everybody, it has been a while, but I'm so thrilled to be back with you for Trek Politics. I'm Mary Trump here with Bob CESCA and Mark Altman. This is so cool to see you guys.
Oh, it's so great to be here, Mary. The last time I saw you on a big screen was, of course, the panel. So this is full circle. I'm looking forward to talking about what happened at Star Trek Las Vegas. Such a great time.
Yeah, it was amazing, and I'm still sort of recovering from the fact that I wasn't able to be there in person, Mark. But it's so great to have you here to kind of close the loop on what was a highlight of my life, being on a panel at a Star Trek convention. So thank you for making that happen.
Well, it was like 30 Rock from the Sun. You were like the big giant head on the screen looming over all of us.
That's the dream. That's the dream.
It was such a thrill for me, too, I have to tell you, when we were putting together the 4 days of programming and we had our own stage to curate all this sort of alternative programming to the actors talking and telling the same stories they told 100 times in the past. I wanted to do some really interesting, eclectic stuff. And I figured, especially during this, year, this remarkably important year in politics and presidential politics, but as well as congressional and local, that, what could be better than to bring, the co-host of one of my favorite podcasts to the stage. And it was such a thrill for me to have both of you there. Obviously, Mary, as I said on the panel, you're doing the Lord's work out there, holding back the dam. And, Bob, it was such a thrill to spend some time with Bob. We had a great meal. My 15-year-old son and him talked politics for 2 hours, which was remarkable. I wish we could have recorded that panel.
Yeah, your future president's son is what we're talking about here. Yeah, he's great. Very, very smart kid. Yeah.
But it was a remarkable panel. I mean, obviously Mary McDonnell and you are longtime friends. To have her join us, who was just remarkable, and I think had some of the best lines of the panel. Of course, Tim Russ, a frequent guest on your podcast, and then David Goodman joining us from the Writers Guild of America was a terrific addition. And to me, one of the most special people is Ande Kindred. She, is from that era. It's one of the last links to that era that means so much to us, Star Trek, having been the first African-American assistant on the, it was so long ago, they called them secretaries back then at Desilu. She was close with not only Martin Luther King, but Malcolm X and Karenga. I mean, she is the nexus, to steal a phrase, of history, and the Star Trek ethos is so represented in her, and the stories she's able to tell about firsthand of Gene L. Kuhn and Gene Roddenberry and Bobby Justman and Charlie Washburn. It was a remarkable group of people on that stage. No more remarkable than you, Mary, however.
Okay, you're far too kind, but it was honestly, and I know people say this lightly, but I meant it, and I'm sure Bob shares the sentiment. It was an honor to be on that panel.
Just incredible.
And you left out Mark, was also on the panel. So it was just an extraordinary, the scope of the history of the Star Trek universe and where we are now versus where Star Trek shows us where we want to be, And yes, Ande was a highlight. And what was also fascinating about having her there is I didn't realize that she lives in New Zealand and has for quite some time. Yeah. So it was also hearing the perspectives of somebody who's not sort of in the thick of it anymore was fascinating to me as well. And it was almost like having the perspective of somebody from the future looking at us and saying, what are you doing? Yeah. And how are you going to get from where you are now, from where you are to where you want to be?
Mm-hmm. And just so we're clear, those of you who listen to Trek Politics usually and don't know who Mark is, Mark organized all of these panels, or many of the panels at Star Trek Las Vegas, including the politics panel. You're one of the hosts of the Inglorious Treksperts. That's its own podcast universe, and just one of the great experts in Star Trek fandom. You've written books. You've, of course, appeared in so many documentaries about Star Trek, just so everyone is aware of who you are. And the question I have to ask for you, Mark, is, did you run into any resistance as far as having a directly political panel at Star Trek Las Vegas? I think it may have been probably pretty close to being a first for that particular convention. Was there any sort of pushback? Do we want to be divisive like this, or do we want to politicize Star Trek? Did you face any of that in the process?
Well, it's so funny you say that, Bob, because you read my mind. That was actually the next thing I was going to address. I was going to say, part of when we were asked to curate this Trekspert stage, and, this was one of the first ideas for a panel that I knew I wanted to do. I thought the same thing. I said, am I going to get pushback when, I shared the schedule with our friends at Creation, who were immensely supportive of everything we're going to do. And, I ran it by Gary Berman, who is one of the partners in Creation. And to his credit, he was thrilled. He and I was really anticipating that they wouldn't want, this whole idea of, you don't want to alienate one person who's a potential ticket buyer, right? Mm-hmm. Right. But he was like, well, this is great. I only have one caveat. I said, what's that? He says, I have to get a picture with Mary. So I was like, oh, okay, well, what, you don't want a picture with Bob? What? Hey. So I said, I'll give you a picture with me. But he was so supportive. And because it goes back, they started doing these conventions over 50 years ago, and they're, from, like me, from New Yorker, and it goes back to the progressive values of Star Trek that spoke to us, mm-hmm. The nature of meritocracy. But meritocracy is something that's been co-opted by the right, where they think, that's an indictment of diversity initiatives. It's not. It's saying that we need to have a level playing field where the people who have expertise and knowledge and are competent have the opportunity to rise to the top, right? To do, and it's not saying that we should be colorblind or we should just, it's an absurd notion. It's like certain people we know who are born on third base and think they hit a triple. Maybe they think they hit a grand slam, even if they struck out. But so I was really gratified by the fact that Creation was so excited about having you guys and having, you represented at the convention, because of course, as we learned, and it's even a mediocre episode of the original Star Trek, The Savage Curtain, when Uhura is talking to Abraham Lincoln, she says, in the future, we've learned not to fear words. So I would hope that even someone who is, certainly a principled conservative, but even they could sit and hear a different point of view than, and not feel like, why are they at this convention? Because I know, for instance, and I'm sure you heard this too, that Jerry Ryan and Kate were very outspoken, and Tim were very outspoken about who they're voting for president, as they should be, right? And people were very offended and writing on the, how could they politicize? I mean, Star Trek was political from day one.
That's right.
And they say, actors shouldn't have an opinion. No, every American citizen, anyone who cares about this country, needs to have an opinion. And if they have a platform, they should speak out. They shouldn't sit by and say and look back and say, God, I wish I had done something when I had the chance. So I was very gratified with Creation's support. There was no pushback whatsoever. And I know there was just a lot of excitement, enthusiasm, and there was great, super well attended. Obviously, I think, standing room only at the panel, and people were immensely supportive of it.
Yeah, I was really pleased with the audience reaction. Obviously, at a Star Trek convention, you're going to get mostly liberal, progressive leaning people. But I was a little bit concerned because we're bringing this new dimension to the conversation around Star Trek, where we're talking about in an election year. And there was, of course, mentions of the candidates and so forth and the impact they may have on our future. And I think that was, by the way, driving the course of the conversation is, how do we get to the Star Trek future? How do we make these decisions? How do we do the right thing in order to get there, politically, economically, and so forth? And I was really happy that there weren't, vast walkouts. That's, I think, the main thing. And the audience reaction, I think, converse to that, was quite positive. I think there were a lot of applause breaks and things like that. People were really, really into it. And I was so happy about that.
And I'm wondering, Mark, if this was your experience too. I think, one of the things Bob and I have been doing with Trek Politics is making the implicit explicit. Obviously, as we all know, Star Trek has always been political, sometimes not as successfully as others, but the issues have been front and center. And what the way the panel unfolded is, I think we all were tentative a little bit at first, and it turned out to be the audience that helped us be more open about connecting Star Trek to our present day politics, and that was fascinating to me, and it felt very gratifying and affirming, I guess. Was that your experience with this group as well?
I felt very much so that was the case, that we sort of waded in a little slowly. Not that the panel wasn't compelling. I think it was remarkably compelling. But I do think there was certain reluctance to be too in your face, because I think we did want to be respectful of people who had different political opinions. Again, the principled conservatives, not the MAGA people, just people who were not living on freaking Alpha Centauri, but people who, have something left of a brain. But I do feel that as it went on, because the way that Star Trek Politics is covered, it's always so perfunctory. It's always, they show the clip from Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. It's like black on the white, right? Oh, look at Star Trek. It was so, but it's so much deeper than that. Yeah. The complexities of the way it dealt with war and the military industrial complex, and the way that it dealt with race relations. And it's it's so much more. And then even you get in the Next Generation, and dealing with the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and it goes on through certainly Deep Space Nine when you look at something like Far Beyond the Stars, and totally. Deep Space Nine was perhaps the most political of all the series. So it's hard to say don't politicize Star Trek, because Star Trek from day one was remarkably political. And I think what was so fascinating is you have these people like Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn, who came back from World War II, and in Gene Kuhn's case, Korea, who just hated war. And so everything in Star Trek is sort of an indictment of war, and but they still believe peace through strength. I mean, there's definitely, we talked a little bit about Kennedy-esque New Frontier zeal, but they were so unique, but they had really gone through horrible times as people who had fought and seen people they cared about die in World War II, and so they had a very unique perspective on things. I mean, Gene Kuhn's father was a Klansman. Gene Roddenberry's father was incredibly racist. He grew up in Texas, and so they learned from that, and they grew, and they weren't perfect. People criticize the way that Gene Roddenberry, may have behaved, or the way he dealt with LGBT issues and things like that. But you can't deny the fact that how truly ahead of its time it was. I mean, Ande talks about the fact that, casting Percy Rodriguez as a Commodore in Court Martial, yes, to have Captain Kirk reporting to an African-American superior. Now we look at that and it doesn't resonate the way it's 1966. Mm-hmm. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. Before there were black admirals in the actual Navy. So that's how forward thinking it was. It truly is.
Colin Powell was 40 years down the road.
Yeah, exactly. And, one of the things that I wish we had maybe 2 or 3 more hours doing that panel. I felt like, wow, this is just not enough time to dig into this, because one of the things that fascinates me, Mark and Mary, is that I think there's a doctoral thesis in what is it about Star Trek that conservatives latch on to? And during the Q&A toward the end, there was someone who had previously identified as a conservative and was more, I guess, libertarian at that point in time. And I really wanted to get into what is it about Star Trek that attracts you to it, knowing that its politics, its core values are extremely progressive. And that I think that's something for maybe a future conversation. But boy, I would love to dive in and talk to actual conservative Star Trek fans and start a running list of some of the things that they connect with. And in the context of one of these panels, that's a perfect way to actually do that. And I was hoping, in fact, that there'd be more conservatives up there asking questions so that we could dig into that territory, which we weren't able to do necessarily, but certainly a conversation for another time.
It does seem to be interesting to me, though, that, well, a couple things. Obviously, I don't know very many Star Trek cast people or production people, but it does seem, of those I have met and know a bit about, that we all pretty much share the same political philosophies.
Yeah.
I don't see a lot of, at least I don't know of any conservative Republicans who are involved in Star Trek. So I don't know that there's a large number of fans who would fit in that group either. But it makes more sense to me that a conservative would be a fan than a libertarian, because you do have it is within the structure of a military organization. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, like as a kid, I never saw it that way. I mean, I like the order of it because I needed order, but I was drawn to the relationships, but also to the exploration part of it, and the fact that human beings had evolved to be kind. Mm-hmm. Like kindness was central to their philosophy about how to be a human being and or any sentient being. Mm-hmm. So that's what drew me. But
yeah, I think we mentioned in the context of the panel too, the fact that maybe the entry point into Star Trek has certain conservative elements to it. The space battles and the military hierarchy of Starfleet. These are things that when I was 6, 7 years old, that's what I was really into about Star Trek. It never occurred to me that there were a certain set of values that it was trying to instill on its audience. And so that was my entryway into it just as a kid. But I imagine maybe some conservative fans latch on to that initially, and then that becomes their whole point of watching the show on as they grow, and as the show expanded to the next generation and the other series, they just got kind of stuck in that point of view of the show, not really necessarily seeing the other stuff or knowing that it's there, knowing that the progressive values are there, but ignoring that and just focusing on the things that they connect to. So maybe that's
it's something that really fascinates me, because I wonder how this show that speaks to me, people like me so strongly, can also be like the favorite show of someone like Ted Cruz. Like, I don't get it, right?
Yeah.
And I say that not like in an indicting way, but more like I don't get it. And so when you say it would be interesting to get conservatives, we tried to do that, and it was very interesting. In an episode of our show, we did an episode on the politics of Trek, and we had a pastor who's a conservative. But what it turned out as we talked to him, or as I talked to him in this case, that he was more of a Bushy. So he was not a Trumpy, right? He was not MAGA. He was concerned, and he spoke very articulately about what in Star Trek resonated for him. And that was interesting. It kind of opened, not opened my eyes, but it was interesting to hear his perspective. But I don't get how anyone who supports this clown who's running for president now,
whatever his name is,
could actually be a Star Trek fan. And yet, I know they exist because we've seen it on social, and I know a lot of people listen to our show. I mean, I've been told, people say, I'm never listening to the show again if Mark's going to talk about politics. And it's like, don't listen to my show again. I don't care.
That's the best attitude to have.
It's like, it is what it is. And, so I am curious about that. And, obviously because we had Mary, we spent a fair amount of time talking about the politics of Battlestar Galactica. We cheated a little bit. We changed the conditions of the test, but it was fine because it was so fascinating. And obviously the way that Ron Moore it dealt with politics in Galactica was so fascinating and so much mired in the real world. But I think that also took us away from Star Trek for a little bit. Yeah. So it is something to explore. I mean, I thought it was really interesting to hear the woman who worked for the CIA. And it's amazing that in the past, I would think more right-ish, people more right-leaning would have had her back. And now that they've demonized the FBI and the security and the CIA and the NSA, it's unbelievable to me. Mm-hmm. It is I cannot believe we live in a world in which we as the left are defending them, and the right is attacking people who've given their lives in a nonpartisan way to protect this country. I was so moved to hear her speak as one of the many people you mentioned who spoke up during and again, I wish that panel had been, as you say, 3 or 4 hours because there was so much left to, as the kids say, still to unpack.
Mm-hmm.
I am glad we got to ask Mary about her favorite Star Trek episodes and give a little shout out to WPIX.
Yeah, well, WPIX saved my childhood, I'll tell you. But I should have been prepared for that question, but I because literally, what is my favorite? There's so many of them that I didn't mention because there wasn't time. But I seriously hope we do this again. We need to take the show on the road because it was really fab, and it would be nice to have more time to explore I love talking about Battlestar Galactica in the context of Star Trek. I think it's one of the most brilliant shows ever made. I'm deeply attached to Battlestar Galactica 2.0. But also some other things we got to touch on, which because of the ways in which the Star Trek ethos was so woven in to the show from the very beginning, it has been able to evolve. So by the time you get to DS9, you are dealing with LGBTQ issues in a more positive way. And then you get to Discovery, like everybody's part of the LGBTQ plus community, So that there's so much of this that deserves more time. And, Mark, hopefully we will keep doing this. And especially after November when things are
return to a degree of normalcy, let's hope.
Yeah. And hopefully we're living in a world where the Fraternal Order of Police does not endorse the criminal who supports people who try to murder cops, for example. That kind of time.
It's a much larger conversation.
Oh yeah.
Drop that right at the end, but I just remind what you were talking about earlier about how the left is now defending the FBI, the CIA,
and it's interesting because you mentioned earlier, and I know we have to wrap up, that where are the conservatives in Star Trek? There are conservatives in Star Trek. I mean, Manny Koto, may rest in peace, was very conservative. But he didn't wear it on his sleeve, and he still had a tremendous respect for Star Trek. And I also understand he came from Cuba. I mean, I understand where that came from. Obviously there's certain actors in the Voyager cast that are more right-leaning, not two of my favorite people, not only for that, but, so I think, look, there's a much deeper conversation to be had, like you said, about Star Trek, Galactica, For All Mankind, all these sci-fi shows that speak to the politics of our time. And, hopefully it is, we will be able to involve a conservative perspective if we can find someone who hasn't completely gone over to the dark side, who is the loyal opposition as opposed to some crazy fascist. Right. So hopefully that day will come where we can go back to having civil conversations on an elevated level about all these things, because there is a fascinating conversation to be had about the politics of Star Trek and how it evolved and how Next Generation was different. The politics of Next Gen were different than the politics of the original show and during the Bush era. And then you have, Deep Space Nine after the riots in LA and how that affected, and then dealing with the homeless crisis. And I mean, there's so much complexity to Star Trek and to Galactica and For All Mankind. And it'd be so great to be able to talk about that without having this sort of Damocles hanging over us and our country.
Well, Mark, it was such a privilege to be a part of that panel and to be included in the entire convention. I had the time, it was my first convention, my first Star Trek convention ever. And it was such a blast from beginning to end. And of course, the great highlight was getting to sit on that panel with so many other.
Not talking to my son. I thought I was having dinner with my son.
That's right. Well, he could have been on the panel. Actually, you know what? He would have been a great panelist on that thing. But to be sitting there with so many smart, talented people who knew exactly what they were talking about and had such excellent insights, and I'm looking forward to hearing reactions about Tim Russ's voting conundrum, his electoral conundrum that he brings up in the conversation. So I'm really excited to see. I'm really excited for everyone to hear this finally, who wasn't able to attend.
And I think what Tim was, it may be tough in the audio, because this was Zoom audio to parse, is what Tim was asking was, what would you do if you were Laura Roslin and had the opportunity to cheat to avoid a greater evil? Yeah. And so I think that's what he was, the analogy that he was making at that point. So anyway, we'll be interested to hear what people say, but keep on. So excited to hear that Trek Politics is inching its way back to the airwaves. You can't really say podcast, not really the airwaves, but I'm living in 1986 apparently still. But thank you guys so much for doing it. I mean, some crazy guy from some Star Trek podcast reaches out and says, I'd love to have you come and join us on stage to talk about the politics, and you both answered the bat signal, and I'm so appreciative. I mean, you guys are remarkable. I'm so glad I got to meet you, Bob, and really, Mary, it was a true highlight of my convention and my life in the political sphere, such as it is, to spend even this little bit of time with you, and just so appreciative of everything that you're doing for this country and for people who care about our future.
Well, I'm blushing now. But thank you. I mean, honestly, I was thrilled when I found out that we were going. Obviously, didn't end up actually going, unfortunately, because circumstances arose. But I think that panel was extraordinary, and it was just sort of the shape of things to come. As you said, there's so much more to talk about, to dig deep into, and we are in a place where we need to be having these conversations. We can't go back, but we need to move forward. And I think conversations like that fill a void that has become gaping over the last several years. So
people are scared to have the conversation. It's what you said earlier. They feel like we don't want to alienate anyone. We don't want to antagonize. So we're not going to have the conversation. But it used to be you could have spirited debates and still be friends, right? Because it was you find common ground. Common ground is much rarer to find now than ever. But I'll tell you where I found common ground. I love Mary's favorite Star Trek episodes. Impeccable taste. Impeccable taste. Everything. There's nothing not to like about you, man. Your taste in Star Trek is excellent.
All right, you just made my day.
Very true.
Thank you both.
Well, thank you, Mark and Bob. It's great to be back with you again. It's been far too long.
Yes.
But yeah, we're gonna keep fighting the good fight. So we hope everybody enjoys the panel, because again, it was a highlight of my life, and it was extraordinary from beginning to end.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
Starbucks Iced Apple Crisp Oat Milk Shaken Espresso. Made with blonde espresso, creamy oat milk, and spiced apple flavors. It's an icy crisp sip you can enjoy all autumn long. Order ahead on the Starbucks app.
Sound familiar? Loud, persistent snoring and gasping for air could be signs of sleep apnea. Visit philips.com/sleep quiz and take the symptoms quiz to find out if you or your partner may be at risk of sleep apnea. Start your journey to better sleep. Please note, the symptoms quiz is only for information gathering that you can share with your doctor.
But the new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises. It is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer to the American people, but what I intend to ask of them. It appeals to their pride. It appeals to our pride, not our security. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here, whether we seek it or not. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered province of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus. It would be easier to shrink from that new frontier, to look to the safe mediocrity of the past, to be lulled by good intentions and high rhetoric, and those who prefer that course should not vote for me or the Democratic Party.
This is a panel I've been looking forward to so much all weekend. It's actually been a panel I've been looking forward to since hearing Bob CESCA and Mary Trump's magnificent podcast, Trek Politics. And since the very beginning, politics has been an integral part of Star Trek. People have looked through the lens at how it's examined social issues, how it's examined the world we live in, and the world we want to live in. And I'm so glad to see so many of you here because we put together a really spectacular panel of people. I'm just absolutely thrilled. So I'm bringing out to co-moderate with me. He's the former president of the Writers Guild of America. He's at the forefront of issues facing writers today, artists today, and I'm delighted that he's agreed to join me. It's none other than David A. Goodman. David, welcome. If not, I'll be on my feet. He is the host of the Bob CESCA Show. He is the co-host of Trek Politics. I've gotten to know him over the last couple of days here at Star Trek Las Vegas. And in addition to his expertise on politics, he knows almost as much about Star Trek as I do. Bob CESCA. This is a very special woman. You met her on our first panel on Thursday. I'm so delighted to have her back. Many of you who've gone to her booth or have read her book, From Slavery to the Stars, have marveled at her incredible stories. Star Trek is only a small part of her life, but it is a very important part to us. She worked with Gene Coon on the original Star Trek. She was the first African-American assistant, thanks to Lucille Ball opening the door at Desilu. She marched alongside Martin Luther King and Malcolm and has just amazing stories and is a firsthand accounts of that very turbulent decade. We're so thrilled to once again welcome the great Ande Richardson. Also joining us, you know him as a very logical man, and I know he will have a lot to offer this panel. We're so thrilled to have him join us. If you looked at his Instagram, you know he is very active politically. He's had great insight and great memes about the current political climate. He is a terrific guy, also a longtime Star Trek fan, which makes him even more wonderful, Tim Russ. And I like to think that these two franchises exist in the same universe. One takes place very close to us, and another takes place, well, not in a galaxy far, far away, long ago and far away and without tribes of humans. Oh, that's the other Galactica. But this next, we're so lucky to have her. She is a remarkable actress, nominated for an Oscar for Dances with Wolves. You've loved her in everything from Independence Day to Major Crimes, and of course, Ron Moore's crowning achievement, the brilliant Battlestar Galactica. Hail to the Chief, Mary McDonnell. And of course, I didn't mention her most recent credit, Plan 9 from Outer Space.
It was by far my best role.
And of course, we're so thrilled to welcome her. I know she'd love to be here in person. Unfortunately, for good reason, she couldn't be here, but she is joining us through the magic of technology on the big screen. You are on. It's Mary Trump. I got to ask you, and this is something I think for anyone who wants to jump in. People always say, they use this example of Star Trek's progressiveness. Oh, remember, let that be your last battlefield. It was back on the left, right on the other. Wow, wasn't that a stunning instance of racism? But you rightly pointed out what was more effective was casting people like Percy Rodriguez as an admiral who was Kirk's superior, or casting William Marshall as the most brilliant man in the universe. And that spoke to black and white people. Maybe not all.
Equally. Perhaps, I think there was three things for me. Devil in the Dark, which was resolving a dispute, resolving a conflict, stopping a war. Let this be your last battlefield, which was like everybody loses here if you keep acting that way. And the third was City on the Edge of Forever, which talked about self-sacrifice, giving up what you care about most for the good, much like Biden did. You know, giving up what you really want and think you could have, but you want your country's more important.
Right. So, Bob, it is the good of the many outweighs the good of the few or the one, isn't it? I mean, isn't that a message?
Yeah, those three are the ones for me that defined their politics at that time.
Star Trek offers us a message of self-sacrifice, that we think about our community, we think about the world, we don't just think about ourselves, unlike other people, certain people.
Right, and then one of the most intriguing things about it is Star Trek offers this roadmap to the future. It offers us something to aspire to. And if we make all the right decisions along the way in our future trajectory, political decisions, economic decisions, ethical decisions, we have this reward waiting for us at the end, this utopian future. And one of the most intriguing things, it's also really tantalizing and sometimes frustrating too, because I want that to be the future now. I want to be in that place now. But I'm satisfied knowing that when we make the right decisions, we get a little bit closer to that future. For example, the political decisions of this year. I feel as though with someone like Kamala Harris, and maybe even the possibility of a running mate like Mark Kelly, I see our future getting a little bit closer to the Star Trek timeline. And that's one of the many kinds of decisions that if we all do this collectively, if we all bear this in mind, we can get there. And it's just, and then when we make the wrong decisions, it's the opposite effect. We end up moving farther away from that. And even, you know what, is a sort of a sideline, a show like For All Mankind also offers a similar kind of hope that if we can strive for things beyond our immediate reach, that eventually we get to those things. It was an amazing gift from Gene Roddenberry to give us that. And the challenge is then to make it to that future without annihilating ourselves first. Whether it's World War III or the Eugenics War or something like that, the Second Civil War has been introduced into canon now. So if we can avoid that, we can get there. And that's so intriguing, so tantalizing.
Mary, do we have you now? Can we hear you?
I believe you. I think so.
Wow, there she is. Obviously, it's no secret that you have put yourself on the line to fight for what you believe in and been such a champion for very important, well, we know what you've been doing, and it's for many of us, it's extremely laudable, and we admire you greatly. What was Star Trek the beginning, in a way, of your awareness of politics? And can you speak to how it has framed your thoughts about politics?
Yeah, first of all, I'm so sad not to be there. I can't even tell you what a hard decision it was to make, but I'm thrilled that you guys got this workaround that I can be there, at least through the internet. And this panel is like mind-blowing. So I'm just honored beyond words to be part of it. You know, I don't want to overstate the case, but this actually all happens to be true. Once I got through reading children's books, the first genre that really spoke to me was science fiction. I was a huge Isaac Asimov person, and Bradbury's The Martian Chronicles I still think is the best science fiction book ever written. But Star Trek was on WPIX Channel 11 in reruns from the time I was little, and I think it was on Friday nights, and I looked forward to it every night. And you know, obviously I was very young, so I didn't see it in terms of politics. I think I experienced it because, again, I wouldn't have been consciously aware of this necessarily. I experienced it as what you were referencing earlier, the idea that in a just society, in a society that is the kind of society worth striving for, we put the good of the many above ourselves on when we need to, in order to make the kind of progress necessary in order to have a world that's worth living in a world that values community and art and creativity and leaves behind the things that divide us. So I wasn't exactly a lonely kid. I was lonely in my family. I know that will probably come as a shock to some of you, but I was pretty isolated within my family because I was so different from everybody. And, you know, I was like a book nerd and loved science fiction, Star Trek. So it gave me a sense of belonging as well. And if that's how those values seeped into my psyche, then I'm so grateful it did, because it makes living through these kinds of times we're living through a little bit easier. And like Bob was saying, it makes somehow this fight we're all in right now makes the future that in my mind I've always thought of as the Star Trek future seem within reach, which it hasn't for a while now.
Tim, I want to ask you, obviously you were a fan of Star Trek since the beginning. what about it spoke to you? What was it you engaged with? And was it this sense of optimism for the future, or seeing people like you reflected on the screen? What was it about it that you connected with?
Well, initially, when I was growing up, we only had 3 channels, and that was it. So there were a lot of series that were running in unison. Besides even Trek, there was several other series that we used to watch all the time, all the way through college, in fact. And Trek was one of them. I, like Mary, was always fascinated with science fiction. So I gravitated to series that were sci-fi, whether it was Outer Limits or Twilight Zone, in this case, Trek. And the thing about Star Trek that was intriguing and very different from any other kind of science fiction was the stories that they told. It was about the stories, and it had always been about the stories. The characters, the decisions they have to make, the alien cultures that they encounter. And I was fascinated by those stories and how intricate they were. It wasn't just a ship traveling through space and blowing things up. It was about dealing with situations with these other cultures. For example, they had stories that framed in the original series that talked about the disparity between the workers and the elite, right? They had that series of the people who worked in the mines and the people who lived in the clouds. And we have this economic sort of disparity going on in this country as we speak, not the world. And they portrayed that far back in time. And I'll point out an episode that I directed in Voyager called Living Witness, which we just had a report recently about an AI version of a Kamala Harris political ad, which is totally hoaxed. It was totally faked. It was an AI fake, deep fake, they call it. And on Living Witness, the cultures that were involved were fractured by a deep fake video that was produced, accusing one half of the culture of committing genocide against the other half. And it never happened. And that culture suffered retribution and living as second-class citizens and being treated despairingly because they were believed to have committed this genocide, and then the entire thing was a hoax. It never happened. And that shows you exactly how far ahead of what we are even living in today, right now, that Trek has been historically and even currently telling these stories.
I'm so glad you mentioned that episode of Voyager, because we know that TOS showed us the way and created the template, but other shows have delved deeply into politics as well. And it's interesting how people see them so subjectively. People try and claim Star Trek for themselves. David, you are the head of a major union, the Writers Guild of America. It's fascinating to hear Tim mention cloud minders and the workers fighting for their rights against the Stratus city dwellers, the big moguls up in the sky, led by Jeff Corey. At what point did you go from watching Star Trek for zap guns and phasers and to recognizing there was something deeper here in the politics of it?
Well, I think it was always from the beginning. And I mean, in the strike, it was really easy to make rich people the bad guys because they stepped right into it. They didn't show any concern for the workers, and certainly Star Trek, I think, always inspired me. I'm actually kind of curious to ask some members of the panel, because I think we all acknowledge there's a long way to go. And so I'm really curious for personal stories from you of oppressions you've felt in your career, like a specific a script or role or job that you were given that offended you. Go ahead, Mary.
Did you see me? I raised my hand. I went to Catholic school. You know what I'm saying? I can't not do it. I just talked about this in another panel, so it's right there. In Battlestar Galactica, when Laura Roslin had to make a decision to ban abortion, that was a very difficult thing for Mary, her life, her ego, to commit to. Laura's intention, Laura's goodwill, Laura's vision for the human race incorporated a whole other idea that I would not have agreed with, right? Easy to commit to the intention of a human being who's devoted to life, even if the intention isn't necessarily fit into your own political or spiritual mindset. Roll the tape forward recently in House of Usher. I am playing probably the most unethical human being that I have ever played. But in her monologue, she takes down the Supreme Court for the decision on abortion. And I found that so extraordinary that I had the great good fortune of experiencing human beings making choices that are outside of the way we try to label each other. And the gray area that we get stuck in over and over again, trying to understand those difficult moments.
Well, it's also as an actor, you had to get into the mind of someone who is not you and understand where they're coming from, which to me is always the story of Star Trek, is understand where the person on the other side is.
The other.
Even if they offend you or revolt you. Tim, was there anything from you?
Yeah, I when I first started out as an actor in the early 80s, you can attest to this, the roles that I was being offered at the time were all either gang members or drug dealers or criminals or whatever it was. And I had to play a few of these types of roles when I first started out because those were the only parts that were coming across to me. And I did play them at the time because I needed to get my career started. But later on, that sort of dissipated and almost is non-existent, really. And we can see the difference now that is being portrayed on the screen, on the television, and on the big screen, that African Americans, minorities are being portrayed in all kinds of roles now. And we are seeing relationships, gay relationships on commercials, interracial marriages on commercials. That did not occur. When I started out, that was non-existent. You never saw that. So there has been a bit of a march here moving forward, just ever so slightly, one step at a time, towards that sort of ideal Star Trek sort of universe in terms of how our entertainment, how our visual medium is coming along in the portrayal of minorities. Because I have played everything up until the Vulcan on the starship as an officer on the bridge. There has been some movement in that regard to the media, so that young people who are growing up now, and who, by the way, are the ones who always lead the revolutions, the young people are seeing these images and they are commonplace. And the more we see that, the more society will change.
Ande, of course, you were very close with Martin Luther King, who was also almost like Mary, a big Star Trek fan, right? Who you wouldn't have expected to be a big Star Trek fan. Of course, everyone knows the story Nichelle tells. Can you talk a bit about how Star Trek was taking its cues from the civil rights struggle of the 60s?
Well, Gene Coon and Martin Luther King had something in common. We found out very early. They had both been very much influenced by the person who created the Serenity Prayer. I lost his name again. And they both had very strong values and ethics. So they couldn't do that. I mean, Gene still was a little bit of a sexist. You know, women were still different, but I didn't, and most women didn't. But what you were saying, when Percy Rodriguez got cast on Peyton Place, the LA Times front page story was Negro actor plays doctor.
Wow.
Yeah. You know, and when we sometimes
about the doctor who was the first, the black doctor was the first surgeon to operate on a heart.
Mary, I have to ask you, you know, it's interesting. I think a lot of us on this stage feel, you know, Star Trek is a very progressive vision of the future. It shows the best of us, the best of what we can be. There is, I've noticed in fandom on the other side of the aisle, some more conservative fans who feel because the Enterprise is largely a naval vessel, And somehow the right has co-opted military service as though it belongs to the right? Which is absurd. And I just wonder if this whole idea of Star Trek being a military operation initially, yet conflicts at all with our idea of Star Trek being a liberal, progressive vision of the future. I don't think so at all. And of course, the Prime Directive and all of this. What was your perception of sort of the original Star Trek and how that vision has evolved and how the politics may have evolved over time? Because of course, the original series is a very JFK version. We talked about the New Frontier. This panel is from the New Frontier to the Final Frontier. It very much encapsulates that Kennedy-esque vision of the future, of going forward into the future, and being aspirational about the better, to steal Lincoln's phrase, the better angels of our nature.
Actually, Bob and I talked about this a lot on our sadly short-lived, but hopefully soon to be resurrected show. It is kind of amazing what people will tell themselves in order to co-opt something they love, without having to grapple with what's really going on. And we do see that on the right, with Star Trek. But honestly, as a kid, all of that, the military stuff went over my head. I always believed and experienced Star Trek as being about exploration and meeting new cultures and new civilizations and learning from them and not interfere. Like the Prime Directive, I absolutely loved. Obviously, do we know how many times the Prime Directive has been broken across the series? But
someone in here, I'm sure, knows.
Somebody probably knows. But it's such a pure concept, and as we saw in many episodes, it's a very challenging one sometimes. And I always looked and experienced it as we're not better than, we're different from, and we don't know everything, and we just want to learn and experience and be better. That's the message I always got from Star Trek. So when we see people, and again, obviously we know that there's a lot of politics in Star Trek. However, when I see people trying to politicize it in a way to co-opt it to their own views that are obviously completely contradictory to the message in Star Trek, it is a little bit mystifying. But sometimes it's hard to face the truth about things.
And isn't the Prime Directive sort of an indictment of, say, invading Afghanistan or in Iraq and so many things that we've seen? Because it's saying, don't interfere, manifest destiny. These are all things that the Prime Directive is something laudable in the sense that don't interfere with other cultures, don't destroy other cultures. So in that sense, the Prime Directive itself, created by Gene Kuhn, is something that is very progressive and not conservative.
Absolutely. I wish we applied a Prime Directive to nature. That would be good. A good place to start as well. But yeah, I completely agree with that. And I'm guessing their history that it was based on was more like Korea and Vietnam. And yeah, we've seen how that's played out, and it usually doesn't end well. So I love that progressive vision, and just another way in which this series just is mind-blowingly ahead of its time.
Bob, of course, Star Trek was not infallible. Well, private little war, the domino theory. If we arm the Klingons and the villagers, the hill people equally, then we will have a balance of power, which was a very dullest kind of thing to do. Can you tell us kind of, sort of your feelings about, certainly looking back when you watch some of these episodes, what are your takeaways? Do you think, they sort of missed the boat, or like you really look at it as a product of its time, or?
Yeah, it's a good question. I give Gene Roddenberry an A+ for effort, because, he didn't always get it right, but his heart was in the right place. His core values were strong, and he injected those core values into the show in a time when you really didn't often see that. Obviously, Rod Serling and The Twilight Zone had some of that, but it wasn't really dominant on network television when, as Tim was saying, there were only 3 channels. But sometimes he's kind of had his mid-century attitude in the mix of the writing. And one of the things that Mary and I talk about often is the anti-Vulcan racism on the show, where it's played for jokes, and that's, I think, the intention there. But if you pull back away from Bones constantly pointing out every flaw of Spock throughout, and it's you can see that this character is being kind of portrayed as a jolly racist in a sense. And because all the characters, especially the alien characters in Star Trek, are metaphors for us, which is, one of the things that we use, I think, to justify the fact that it's all human actors wearing something on their head. And so in that respect, when I really feel a lot of empathy for Spock, partly because he can't feel empathy for himself, but at the same time, when he's kind of being ganged up on, and I'm sure Tim's character, Tuvok, faced a little bit of that. For some reason, I don't know why, that the Vulcans are the subject of a lot of needling on the show, but that was one of the areas that I think was, as you were saying, is kind of flawed about that direction. But you have to take it as a whole and know what Gene was striving for. And yet, in that regard, it was positive.
And yet, Mary, isn't it very gutsy of Star Trek to deal with something like xenophobia in the case of Star Trek VI, where Captain Kirk himself is prejudiced against Klingons, and by the end, he is forced to examine his own prejudices? I mean, you could say this is a big popcorn movie, but I mean, that's pretty strong stuff. I mean, even Gene was not thrilled with that, and yet I think that really resonates for us today.
Yes. Well, that's one. That's one of these. Hello. Do you want to talk about Star Trek 6 or?
Let's think about it. We could ask Mary McDonnell about Star Trek 6, but I don't think the answer will be very insightful. Right?
No, it won't. We're asking Mary Trump.
Well, I mean, apart from the movie, but I think one of the many strengths of the show is that kind of ability to critique itself is built in, and there's an evolution across series and across movies that allows for that kind of self-examination and the ability to course correct. And I think that given where the show started, as everybody said, to one degree or another, yeah, there are flaws. And that's because it was a very flawed time, but they were, as Bob said, the intention was there, right? The willingness to push the envelope was there. So I think we even saw some of that happening in Picard too.
Yeah, and in Star Trek VI, there's one scene after they have the big banquet with Chancellor Gorkin and Chang is there, and they're indulging in the Romulan ale. And afterwards, the sort of post-mortem as they proceed into the transporter room and the Klingon delegation beams away. The racism in that room against the Klingons is, looking back at Star Trek VI, is mind-blowing. Some of the things do you see the way they eat? Yeah, and of course it's, again, played for laughs, but this is all to say that the show ultimately, and all the movies and all the series, is a significant net positive. I mean, there are those flaws, but everything is moving forward, everything is progressive, everything is inclusive. And if they don't always get it right, that's okay, and we learn from that.
Mary McDonnell, I'm getting the hang of this now.
You could call me Madam President.
Yeah. I like that.
And partially because, we've got to get used to the female Madam President. Right? Talk about progressive. Here we go. Right? Anyway, just call me MP and then,
I can't say Trump. I'm sorry.
That's all right. She's Mary and I'm Madam President. What would you like to ask me, sir?
Well, you talked about, Star Trek is the gift that keeps on giving, because Ron Moore grew up as a huge Star Trek fan. He conceived and developed the new Battlestar Galactica. You talked about how you dealt with the abortion issue. I think there's a really powerful storyline, which is very applicable to what we've been going through in this country, which, of course, is when you try to steal the vote, right? And it shows even people with the best intentions, because you can't allow Baltar to become the president because you know what he's capable of. And
it asks a really great question. Would you cheat to stop someone you know is evil from becoming president?
Well, I would. No, I mean, it is a big deal question, isn't it? And it was a big deal on the show. And that, as well as the abortion moment for Laura, she really had to measure what's the end game here. Is the end game to me personally feel comfortable in my own ethical code and me to fulfill what I think is right for myself and everyone else? Or is the end game the survival of the human race and the ability to live together and to not have an evil, maniacal, egotistical, narcissistic, should I keep going, human being?
Keep going.
Mary, you want to jump in?
Keep going.
You're good. You're good.
Or to have that human being take over and then, by the way, affect, in that case, it would have been, the sky universe. In this case, it is this particular planet. And I understand that. So stealing an election, I'm not sure, hasn't been done in many ways since the beginning of the world. It is, I think, though, very important for us to understand that what happened in our country a few years ago was a massively violent attempt to impede justice, to impede the Constitution. That's a little bit different than trying everything you can to keep one human being who could destroy our hearts, minds, and souls from getting into power. So I think that's the question is always, I think, for world leaders, and I would never want to be one, what will my action produce, not how do I feel about the ethics of this question. I mean, that's what Laura taught me.
No, and it's such an interesting question, which I don't necessarily think has a right or wrong answer, in the sense that the whole series of the show, she's making these ethical decisions, and even stuff that Adama doesn't necessarily agree with, but he goes along because he values civilian leadership and intelligence and meritocracy.
And he fell in love with her.
And he fell in love with her as well, and who wouldn't? And but ultimately, what happens when they do the right thing? They go to New Caprica, thanks to Baltar. He tanks the economy. He injects hydro. Oh no, he doesn't do that. You are almost destroyed because Baltar makes the wrong decision, and he knew it, and you knew it, that he was going to do always the wrong thing. That he was a narcissist, as you said, and all these other things. And so it's like you go and you look at the ethical conundrum, which just harkens back to Star Trek, asking the deep questions, not always providing the answers, but asking the questions, right? And it's like, what do you do in that situation? Was she right to try and steal the election because obviously this man is unqualified to be president of the colonies? Or does she do the right thing and be true to her morality? There's no answer, is there?
Well, I think that's really, it is sort of the essence of where we are as human beings in a way, and you've all been so right there with it so brilliantly, is what is our ethical core if it's only serving what we think that we want to be? It's really about testing our connection to the greater good, as President Biden just showed us.
It's fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating, that concept. And just with a show of hands, maybe in the audience, if you had 2 votes in your hand, 2 votes that would make the difference between who won and who lost, you had control over it in this election coming up. If you knew that the person that might win could be the dictator and the tyrant who could literally destroy your democracy forever on all your rights, your voting, everything else. And you had 2 votes. You had control. The 2 votes determined the election. And you could throw the 2 in the trash and not have the tyrant, or keep the votes and allow the tyrant. Show of hands, how many people would toss those 2 votes. Interesting. Not that many.
It's hard to admit, though, isn't it?
That's a really tough decision because you would have the ethics of, the right and wrong, right from our standpoint. I can imagine the other side would have no problem tossing them. But our side, looking at that ethically, would you, personally want to do the right thing and then have to suffer the consequences, or knowing what's coming, sacrifice your ethics for that? That is
Isn't that
really
amazing?
fascinating.
It is.
It is a
That's an
fascinating
incredible
dilemma.
question.
Yeah. And not that many people raise their hands.
Well, that's a tough thing to admit, isn't it?
Yeah.
In this room particularly.
It is. I lean personally, and I don't know, I think I might lean to tossing them, to be honest with you. I hate to
would
say
too.
it, but
I
don't know.
absolutely would.
If I knew what was coming, I'd probably lean toward tossing them. I hate to say it, but that's personally what I think I might do,
But we say we hate to say it, and we feel guilty about it, or we don't want to raise our hand about it. And I went through a lot of this with Laura. It's like, however, we could die tomorrow if we did the right thing by not tossing the votes, and millions of people suffered because of the leader. We still have our ethical choice, and then perhaps we die. And I'm not sure I understand that as much as I feel the passion of tossing the vote, because I feel more connected to everyone by tossing the vote. And by not tossing the vote, I just feel like I've maintained something in me. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's like I said, for me, it would be it's a difficult decision.
Yes.
It would be something that would be almost, if you'd have that one impulse, that one moment, that one thing. And if you didn't, I guess you could just say, all right, this is the will of this came down to being what it is, and we have to bear, the results and the consequences, and maybe dig ourselves out of it later on. Maybe, I don't know, change things in the future. I don't know.
It's really hard to know because we all want to leave a better world for our friends, our family, our cats,
our children.
Our cats.
Oh, man.
I know there's so many people that want to ask questions, and this is just such a fascinating discussion. But Ande, please.
I want to ask a question. I live in Australia. For the last 50 years, I've lived there. We don't have elections the way you guys have elections. And I don't understand, one, how that people can tell lies on newscasts and no one corrects them. They start to normalize it. Donald, oh, he's back to himself. But where was his self before? I mean, there's that. And the second thing is your electoral college. We would have won all of those elections if they didn't weigh out equal vote, please.
Popular vote wasn't even close. So, is that really democracy? Do you want to answer what Ande had to say, Mary? Do you want to address that? Just
I mean, it's such a brilliant point, and it reminds me that other countries must think that we're insane because it doesn't make any sense. The U.S. Senate is one of the most undemocratic institutions, and the Electoral College is another one. And we seem conveniently to forget that so much of the way the system was set up was to benefit states that enslaved human beings. So I think it's long past time that we rectified that situation. And, we live in a country in which Biden could have lost with 8 million more popular votes. The margin was really 44,000 votes in 3 states. So that's a kind of terrifying fine line. But, I think it makes the question that Tim asked and the hypothetical that Mary entertained even clearer to me, because we're not talking about stealing an election in a system that works for all of us. We're talking about living in a country in which the playing field is not level and the system is broken. And
That's right.
The guy who wants to be a dictator the guy who's out for himself and wants to destroy not only American democracy, because remember, we're running against the clock here. We've got climate change. We're talking about Western liberal democracy, not just in the United States. We're talking about aligning ourselves with dictators and autocrats. So he has an advantage. He has an unfair advantage because of the Electoral College, because of gerrymandering, because of the Supreme Court, and I could go on and on and on. So is it really cheating? I mean, maybe it's a good thing that, a lot of us don't have any control over the situation. I'm not sure, but I would forgive me, Tim, if I get this wrong. Throwing away the votes means we win.
It means you get rid of that dude.
Yes, throwing away the vote, and thank you very much for justifying my decision to throw away the 2 votes.
I wouldn't even hesitate. I would feel guilty about it, and I would do it all day long.
I have no problem with that at all. You're absolutely right. That made total sense. Of course, it's an unjust.
Throwing away the votes might be winning.
Yes, it may throwing away the votes.
Should we do another technical? No,
yeah, would mean we won, and because what Mary just pointed out is the playing field is not level to begin with. In every one of those points, she's right.
I also want to point out, because this could be taken out of context, as we know people do, this is a hypothetical discussion. No one has cheated in an election. These are not illegal results. Nobody has manipulated things.
Well,
nobody's going to.
Some people tried.
No, we're not doing that. No.
Only in TV series.
Only in theory. Only in theory. Only in the movie.
I want to watch this TV series. I like this cast. I want to go to audience questions because I know you're here to talk to the and before I do that, I just want to say one thing to think about as you talk to the audience. We talked a lot about how Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica were so ahead of their time and presented all these issues in a very unique way. Star Trek hasn't always been ahead of the curve. Talked a lot about the gay issues, which Next Generation was a little retrograde. It didn't get. I mean, it was very tentative. Let's say it was very tentative with the host and the outcast. But more often than not, it's been ahead of the curve, and it's certainly been the self-correcting franchise as well. Galactica, much more so. But again, it's sort of the son of Star Trek, thanks to Ron, the influence on Ron Moore. But God, there's so much more I want to ask, but I'm going to let the audience because that's why they're paying the big bucks.
Hi, my name is Joe Coolman, and first off, I want to thank you. This has been a masterclass, and Madam President, your previous session also a masterclass. So thank you for that. And Miss Trump, every time you're on my TV, I crank you up. I think, if I'd grown up with you, we would be great friends because we have a lot in common. I've read your book. It gave me great insights during a troubling time and struck me with profound sadness because of the family disease of alcoholism. I've gone to Al-Anon for 10 years. If you're suffering from somebody in your life who has addiction, Al-Anon may also help you, and my heart goes out to you. I firmly believe we have a binary choice. Neither choice gives us everything that we want. One choice gives us a shot. The other choice, we may suffer consequences that we cannot even imagine. That is why I'm volunteering for, I am donating to, and I am voting for, come hell or high water, Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
If you all believe, could you please tell us what else we can do?
Mary Trump.
Sorry. I was just thinking there for a second. Not Madam. No, we know it's Madam President now. I'm just Mary. So it's a great. First of all, thank you so much for your kind words. It means a lot to me, honestly. When people got something out of my book and found it helpful, if hard. Because I know, especially during the last 8 years, especially during COVID, people dealing with substance abuse issues and their family members really suffered greatly and alone a lot of times. As for this election, I completely agree with you. It's a binary choice. Everything is at stake. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but it happens to be true. So it's not. Some people like to knock on doors. Believe it or not, writing postcards is incredibly effective. Phone banking. And what I would also suggest is start having real conversations with people because I think that things are shifting, and I don't mean the true believers. I wouldn't. Now is not the time for that. But people who are maybe just starting to pay attention, start having really hard conversations. And like when I'm confronted, as I sometimes am, with people who hate me, I say, listen, you want people like me dead or to leave the country. I just want you guys to have healthcare. So that's sort of my response to that, and just maybe try to open up a conversation that way. What do you think you get versus what you'll get if President Harris is running things?
Also, there's an old Vulcan proverb: "The perfect is the enemy of the good." So
right.
Go with good over perfect.
Hello. So my question has to do with conservatism as a philosophy, and whether there is a conservatism that's compatible with the vision of Star Trek. And the basis of my question is, I consider myself a centrist who, up until recently, would say I lean conservative. But when I said that, I meant I support NATO, I support our institutions, I support the framework of our society, and supporting our allies. I'm a 12-year Army member. I was a sergeant when Afghanistan was falling apart. I was in Kuwait. And after Afghanistan fell apart, I started seeing all of the buildup of Russia on the border of Ukraine. So now I'm looking at it. I'm a one-issue voter. I'm voting for whoever wants to support our allies in their fight against this neo-fascistic regime in the Kremlin. And what does, in light of that and the way that conservatism has just been hijacked, what is a conservatism that makes sense in the perspective of the Star Trek philosophy?
I think individual liberty. I think that's something that I think you can draw from many examples in Star Trek, and I think that is compatible with conservatism. I would actually love to ask you a question, which is, when you identified as conservative, what was it about Star Trek that attracted you to the show, knowing that its values, its core values, were very, very progressive and maybe not entirely compatible with your values? What was it about Star Trek that connected you to it?
Well, honestly, that's hard to answer, because I was watching Undiscovered Country in the theater when I was 1 year old. So I've been watching Star Trek since before I can remember. But I never saw Star Trek as being against these fundamental things. What's confusing to me is how the term no longer has a meaning that's compatible with our society, functioning for each other's good. Like, my understanding was, hey, let's make sure the budget makes sense, because if we run out of money, everyone's screwed. Not, hey, let's not help these people because I want to spend the money on this other thing. Or let's not help our allies. Like, Estonia came to our aid when they weren't even a NATO member back when we went into Afghanistan. We've had so many allies who have put their necks on the line, and now we have people who supposedly support the military and support our allies saying, hey, I'll let the Russians do whatever they want. It makes no sense.
Yeah, I feel like the version of conservatism that you're talking about is maybe now archaic. I think it's been co-opted by a cult of personality. It's been co-opted by a single person, and rather than having its own values that it pursues, which are perfectly valid. By the way, no one's excluding conservatism from Star Trek. If you're a conservative and you like Star Trek, great. But I think what's happened to conservatism, it's been bastardized and co-opted and driven way off the rails. So it's very difficult to find common ground between, for lack of a better term, MAGA conservatism and something like Star Trek or any of the other shows that we're talking about.
But Bob, we need the Vulcans and the Bajorans and the Tellarites to pay their fair share to be in the Federation.
And you know what? There are the Ferengi. I mean, I guess if you're conservatives, you value free market capitalism, the Ferengi are your species.
Unregulated free market capitalism.
Exactly.
Conservatives have been canceled.
You took down, you plussed it. Nice job.
I had a different question, so I'm just going to out myself a little bit. I served at the Central Intelligence Agency during the Bush, Obama, and at the beginning of the Trump years. And I saw a lot. Tim and I got political 2 nights ago, so he knows where this is going. I saw.
Are you recording this right now? Is that?
I saw.
Are you?
I am actually.
Are you still working for the CIA? I just want to make.
Is there a dart gun in your phone?
But as a sci-fi nerd and a policy person, I was the one that asked the Dobbs Galactica question in the previous panel. Mary Trump, you've stuck your neck out so many times at great risk to yourself, especially things like the Russian issue, the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, the gentleman that came from the Army, who I'm sure had at least a secret clearance. I mean, no matter your politics, we swore an oath to a constitution, and classified information is classified information. Mary, can you talk a little bit, because I don't know if you're not looking at that particular corner of the world, and you're much better at this than I am. Can you talk a little bit about the handling of classified and what maybe some people should know about the sanctity of the work that is done and the damage that potentially the massive amount of money that went to Jared and whatnot, just to edify potentially people within the audience. And thank you again for being a nerd avenger. Mary, you're amazing. Thank
you. Thank you. Well, I'm actually madly trying to figure out how to connect this to Star Trek. But I know this, that any Star Trek officer would never have done what Donald did. That's for sure. What happened? One of the frustrating things about what we're dealing with right now, especially vis-a-vis the Supreme Court decision that essentially has given Donald unimaginable immunity and has put many of his trials on hold, perhaps indefinitely, is that we saw him commit the crimes. We saw him incite an insurrection against our government, and we know he stole those documents because he admitted he stole them. We got them back from him, at least some of them, all of them, who knows? But a lot of people, because of how the case has been handled by the utterly corrupt Judge Aileen Cannon, and because of how long it took to get an indictment, think it's not a big deal. What he did was potentially, and we may never know, because of how classified some of these documents were. They were the most highly classified documents. They contained information about human intelligence. He may very well have put at serious risk people who risked their lives for our country. Some of them Americans, some of them allies. So that to me is one of the things that I believe he absolutely cannot get away with, because who knows? I have no doubt. Listen, I mean, we know that if he could sell them to the highest bidder, he would sell them to the highest bidder. So nobody should be giving this person the benefit of the doubt, which is why it's so crucially important that we find out what happened and that he pay a price for it. Preferably a trial would be nice, so all of this information can be revealed. And I think with Jared Kushner, it's sort of all of a piece. Jared Kushner has no particular expertise. We know that the governing body in Saudi Arabia that decides whether or not investments are going to be made said that he should not get the money, but Mohammed bin Salman decided that he should get the $2 billion. I'm guessing that was for services rendered, shall we say. And I agree with you. If we take our intelligence seriously, if we value our intelligence community, which we absolutely should, then we need to get the bottom of these things. And the fact that the Republican Party has chosen to look the other way because it's their guy, I think shows us that conservatism, capital C conservatism, is dead.
Well, and it's amazing that the other side of has been demonizing the incredible work that you have done, and the CIA and the FBI, who we're so grateful for keeping this country safe and, shining a light on the intelligence agencies. How dedicated, loyal Americans become the enemy is shocking. Now, I can't believe we have to end this panel because it's extraordinary, but I have to ask the most important question of the day that anyone's going to ask you, Mary Trump. What's your favorite Star Trek episode?
Oh, wow. Okay. There's so many that it's impossible for me to pick one. But can there be a tie?
Sure.
Okay. It's like a tie of like 20 though. I don't think we have enough time. I'm extraordinarily fond of The Trouble with Tribbles. I'm sorry if that makes me a total, nerd, but I love The Trouble with Tribbles, City on the Edge of Forever, of course. And Mirror Mirror. Mirror Mirror, is that the one? Yeah.
In every revolution, there's one woman with a vision.
Everyone. There you go.
Thank you.
Thank
This
you,
is
Mary.
an extraordinary panel. Mr. President, Madam President, Andre Richardson, Tim Russ, Bob CESCA, and Mary Trump.